Hey there guys, so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this GMKtec M7 PRO that has a Ryzen 9 6950H processor, and well, we're going to be pairing that with a Radeon RX 6950X. So we're going to be seeing how well this 6950 pairs with this 6950, and to do that, we're of course going to be using this OCuLink dock. And you can pick these up on AliExpress from anywhere between $30 to $60 depending on what the tariffs are. And what this lets you do is utilize the OCuLink port that is built into the GMKtec M7 PRO. And what this OCuLink port does is it gives you access to 4 PCIe lanes. That's what this graphics card is going to pair up with. So let's have a reality check before we get this thing fully set up. For one, because of that bandwidth limitation, we are not going to get the full capabilities of this graphics card. This might be a bit too high end for a setup like this, but for some reason AMD has such a fascination with the 6950 number scheme. In fact, my very first graphics card that was on a computer that was wholly my own, that wasn't a family computer, was a Radeon HD 6950. So how could I not take a 6950 graphics card and pair it with a 6950 CPU if that is my origins? So let's get all of this up and running. And here is the setup complete. Obviously with OCuLink, it's pretty much impossible to not have a janky looking setup unless you're going to be using one of those pre-built OCuLink docks like the Minis Forum one. With a DIY setup like this, it's going to be pretty jank. So obviously we have the graphics card right here, we have the mini PC, and off to the side here is the power supply. The power supply doesn't really matter all that much. It can be pretty much whatever that you have that can power your graphics card. Though in this case, the 6950 XT does slurp down some power like crazy. It's not going to overwhelm the 750 watt power supply, and realistically, even with a 450 watt one, you could get away with it because you don't have a CPU and motherboard and all these other peripherals to power with it. It's literally all just going to the graphics card. But let's run down through the configuration real quick before we get this thing started. So obviously we know the graphics card, the 6950 XT, 16 gigabytes of DDR6 RAM. The M7 PRO here has a Ryzen 9 6950H processor, and that's an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 3 Plus based processor, and that is a Pro Series part. That doesn't really mean anything though, but it does have 32 gigabytes of RAM, though it is running at 4800 megatransfers. That's pretty much the maximum speed that this chip will allow. That is paired with a 1 terabyte SSD. The way that we're going to have this system configured is that the iGPU is going to have its VRAM dropped down all the way down to 1 gigabyte. That is the minimum that we can set in the BIOS. Of course, the reason we're doing that is because since we're using a graphics card, we don't need any graphics. We don't need the iGPU to have any kind of allocation like that. The next thing that I changed is that I moved the TDP over to the performance setting. The reason that I keep it at balance is that after testing the unit, I find that there is no performance gain to really be gained from performance outside of a slight increase in your CPU performance. And since the CPU is all we care about here and not the iGPU with a setup like this, I felt, well, we might as well use the performance setting. But let's jump in and take a look at some games. So to start things off, we're taking a look at Helldivers 2, and keep in mind that we're testing all games at 1440p because I feel like if you're getting a card like a 6950, you weren't exactly looking to game at 1080p. And as you can see here with Helldivers running at the maximum graphics settings at the native resolution, we're getting some pretty great levels of performance, especially considering that this is a title that really does not run well on the built-in graphics, even at lower than 1080p resolution settings. So the gains here are pretty massive, and surprisingly the GPU is seeing some pretty decent levels of utilization. It's not at 100% utilization though, and that shouldn't be too surprising either. But for a pretty new game, this is a really great result. And it does show the benefit of getting an eGPU setup because we go from an unplayable title to something that runs really well at maximum graphics settings at above 60 FPS. It's not a high refresh rate gaming experience, but it's almost there. The next game that I took a look at was Stalker 2 running at the high graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset. And while at these graphics settings, they might be a little too aggressive. To be fair, the game did default to medium as the setting, but I wanted to push things a little. Though you'll see that the GPU is not at 100% utilization, so we should be able to get better performance out of this graphics card. Unfortunately, it's being held back by this eGPU setup. Still, an FPS average of 65 with 1% lows of 31 means that it is playable. It's just not going to be the greatest, most consistent experience. Now, I did also decide to test out Spider-Man 2, even though it's proven to be extremely demanding on PC, and running at the very high graphics settings with FSR set to quality and no ray tracing enabled. The performance that we got out of this was pretty rock solid for the most part. I mean, I really can't complain about an FPS average of 76 and 1% lows of 51. It's all well within a playable range. There was only the occasional stutter here and there, so it was really an enjoyable time. Another Marvel title that has been surprisingly heavy to run this year has been Marvel Rivals. This Unreal Engine 5 title, while having pretty stylistic graphics that look rather simple, it's pretty heavy on most systems, which is why here running at the high graphics settings with FSR set to quality, the game isn't exactly giving us an amazing result. Though it is a vast improvement over the integrated graphics, which is what you want to see from an eGPU. Considering that this is supposed to be a flagship tier graphics card, this isn't exactly great results. So as a sanity check, I decided to compare the performance between the integrated graphics, the eGPU setup, and of course the 6950 XT paired with a Ryzen 7 5700X. This should bypass the limitation that we have with the PCIe lanes here, while having a relatively similar CPU to what we have with the 6950H, since both of them are Zen 3. Though technically this 6950H is Zen 3 Plus, because it's an APU, it has less cache, but it's still the same architecture. But if we take a look at a Hitman 3, and this is Hitman 3 running at the ultra graphics settings with no FSR at 1440p, you can see that with the eGPU, we are looking at an almost 4x increase in performance just on the FPS average. Our 1 percentiles see a 2x improvement, and as do our 0.2%. But clearly the 6950X is being held back by a pretty significant amount. We see here we're looking at about a loss of 23% of our performance just on the FPS average. The 1% lows see an even bigger 32%, and then the 0.2s are seeing a 28%. So while there is something that you're losing here in terms of performance, there's far more to be gained. But of course, why spend the money on the graphics card if you're going to end up losing this much performance? And it might be worthwhile to look at lower tier. Monster Hunter Wilds was one that surprised me with just how well it performed. Running at the ultra graphics settings and using FSR at the quality preset, the 6950 XT seemed to have done a great job paired with both the 5700X and the 6950H, where this time the eGPU setup only saw an 8% loss in performance in the FPS average, a 13% loss in the 1%, and a 15% loss in the 0.2%. And all of that paired with the fact that we're looking at a 6x increase in performance just on the FPS average in comparison to the iGPU. And I mean, this should tell you that this is a night and day difference. This is a game that you can't even play at 720p on here and get a decent experience just with the iGPU, and suddenly you're playing it at 1440p maxed out. Though you are using FSR, but it's FSR at the quality setting and it's FSR 3.1. So quality wise, it looks really great, at least at the quality setting. It's not comparable to DLSS, but more than likely the quality impact is not going to be noticeable while you're just sitting there playing the game. Of course, you know I always have to throw in Mountain Blade Blade Bannerlord. It is just one of my favorite games ever, so it always has to get thrown in there. And it is running at the maxed out graphics settings, no upscaling whatsoever. The game doesn't even support anything outside of DLSS anyway. And while you can see in comparison to the integrated graphics, we do see a massive uplift, an almost 6x increase in just the FPS average, but we do end up seeing a pretty massive loss in comparison to using a full-size desktop. 57% difference in performance is staggering. Of course, it's by no means unplayable when we're talking about the eGPU setup, but especially those 0.2% and the 1%, it's just such a heavy loss, and you're really leaving a lot of performance on the table, because we're talking about 0.1% on the full setup that are higher than the FPS average that we were getting with the eGPU setup. So this is one of the worst showings that we've seen so far. Now, the last game that I took a look at is Returnal, and this one was the one that gave me the weirdest results. While we of course see a massive uplift in performance in comparison to the iGPU, what was most surprising is that in this title, consistently after multiple runs, the eGPU setup was faster. And I can't for the life of me figure out what it is. I have some assumptions. My biggest guess is the fact that the not great memory configuration of the 5700X system might be limiting things here, though I'm not 100% sure. I'd really have to test things out a lot more to figure out what the problem is here, but I just thought this one was an interesting result. Well, that was certainly interesting to test. Obviously, this is not a good combo, though it is nice to have a 16GB card on an eGPU setup like this. There's better ways to go about it at cheaper prices, though. Looking at the market right now, cheaper might be a pretty relative term. You know, if you really want to have 16GB of RAM on a setup like this, you can always look at something like the 7600 XT. That's more along the levels of performance that would pair well with an eGPU setup like this. But anything past this, and you're going to run into a situation where, while you're going to get good performance, it's not really going to be fully utilizing the graphics card that you paid for. But this really wasn't to see if this was some kind of dream combo. It was more to pay an honor to that pair of Radeon HD 6950s that were in my first gaming PC that was actually my own PC, and to celebrate AMD's weird obsession with the number 6950. So I hope you enjoyed this very nice setup. I'll catch you guys in the next one.